Morning, everyone. And as Philip said, thanks for the opportunity to be here. First, as Philip said, a bit of a change in direction. I think the idea of me speaking in the plenary session is as part of setting the scene, looking at what the government's been doing in providing incentives for both reducing emissions and storing carbon. And so to give you a bit of an idea of some of the governance arrangements, but also some of the progress that's being made as well. Just to show you what's already been achieved, I suppose. So I'll talk about a very brief overview of the scheme, some of the activities that are eligible, some of the progress that's been made, and then I'll come back at the end to some of the particular issues, some of the design issues that we've been dealing with in making sure that emissions reductions, or carbon storage in particular, is genuine, and then also that we can maintain it over time. So just firstly, briefly, the Emissions Reduction Fund, I'm sure some of you are aware of it. It's an economy-wide scheme, so it's not just about negative emissions or storing carbon, it's about being able to reduce emissions and store carbon across all sectors of the economy. And it's a voluntary scheme, and it's designed to help Australia meet its emissions reduction targets. The government allocated $2.5 billion for purchasing emissions reductions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that next. And it's, as I said, it's suitable for businesses, large corporations, and a bit as Professor Hewson said as well, recognises that people are doing these things for a whole range of reasons. You know, there's an economic driver for doing some of these things as well as reducing emissions. So just into some of the details of the scheme, we always describe it as having three components. So the first component refers to crediting, and what that really means is someone decides to do a project under the scheme. They need to apply to the Clean Energy Regulator to register a project, and that project needs to be under a method that's been approved by the government, and a method is really a set of rules for how to undertake an activity and measure the emissions reductions. And I will come back to that in a little bit more detail at the end, but there's some fairly stringent requirements around those methods to make sure that the emissions reductions are genuine. So then once a party has a project registered, they carry it out and report periodically to the Clean Energy Regulator. They get issued credits as they report, so there's no crediting until the emissions reductions or carbon storage is actually achieved. And so you may have heard of Australian carbon credit units. An Australian carbon credit unit is 1 credit equals 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. And for carbon storage projects, they can generate credits for a period of up to 25 years. That's how long their project can be carried out for, recognising that storing carbon is a long-term activity. So that's the first component. So the second component is purchasing, and this is where the government's funds come in. Someone with a registered project can then have the opportunity to bid into an auction, and the Clean Energy Regulator runs these auctions periodically. They're reverse auctions, so it's about the government paying for least cost abatement. If you're successful in an auction, you can then enter into a contract with the government to sell those credits that you've generated from the first part of the process. And again, payments are only made on delivery as well. So that's the second part. I'm only giving a fairly brief overview just to give you an idea of how the scheme works. The other part on contracting, contracts can be for up to 10 years for carbon storage projects. So the last part of the scheme then is the safeguard, and that's really an extra component of the scheme, and it's about helping make sure that emissions reductions achieved through the scheme aren't lost through emissions elsewhere. And so it's a scheme that applies to the large emitters across the economy, and those large emitters accept limits on their emissions and they aren't able to exceed their emissions. I've spoken already a little bit about this, but this gives you an idea of the governance arrangements around the scheme. So it's a legislated scheme. The Minister for the Environment is responsible for the scheme. The Minister approves these methods that I've spoken about. The Minister also determines priorities for developing new methods to provide new opportunities, and also has responsibilities for the rule around that third component, the safeguard mechanism that I spoke about. The department where I work, part of our work, we're responsible for the legislation overall, but we're also responsible for developing The methods working through the details, I'm responsible for the forests part of the methods. We work with working groups of technical experts in doing that. We have an independent expert advisory committee that's also appointed under the legislation called the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee. That committee considers the methods and also reviews them over time, and the Minister's not able to approve a method unless it's been endorsed by the committee as meeting requirements in the legislation. So there's some fairly sound governance around the scheme. And I've mentioned the Clean Energy Regulator. The Clean Energy Regulator is responsible for all the administration of the scheme. So all of the dealing with registering projects, issuing credits and running auctions and administering contracts. So that's my quick run through the scheme. I'm now going to talk about some of the opportunities and what's actually already being done in the carbon storage side of the scheme. So I've talked about methods and the categories here that I've listed on this slide and the next couple of slides are really just talking about some of the particular types of activities and that are eligible under the scheme. And these terms that we've used here are sort of taken from the names of the methods. But I think you can see across there from the vegetation methods, the aim is to provide a sort of coverage across a spectrum of different parts of the landscape. So there are activities, and so those first two examples under protecting existing forest, they're two different titles for essentially a very similar activity. And so that's really around landholders making a commitment to not clear land and so maintain a carbon store, land that they otherwise would have cleared. The next category is around changing land use to promote regeneration of native vegetation. And so that's quite often on land where it has been previously cleared. That category of activity has been particularly successful. There are quite a lot of projects in western areas of New South Wales and Queensland. And to our knowledge, there isn't that sort of method for those sorts of activities in other places in the world. So, you know, we have taken advantage of some of the opportunities that we have in our landscapes in Australia in the scheme. And then the last category is around planting forests, and that includes things like environmental plantings, mixed species environmental plantings for biodiversity benefits as well as commercial plantings, which could be smaller scale farm forestry and plantation forestry as well. So quite a broad range of activities there. The next category, and this is again where in the scheme there's quite a mix between reducing emissions and storing carbon in the scheme as well. So large areas of Australia have across the top end of Australia are burnt annually in the savanna regions and quite a significant contributor to Australia's emissions. There's actually already been quite a lot of success in savanna burning projects across the top end in reducing emissions. So this is just at the reducing emissions end. And the concept around this is that a lot of fires are late in the dry season. When the fuel's all cured, there's a lot of fuel, and so fires are large and then also quite emissions intensive as well. And it's been known for quite a while that, and for a whole lot of reasons, there are benefits in shifting to burning earlier in the dry season. And so the fuel is a bit more moist, fires can be smaller and less intense, and so reduce emissions. So only this year, there's been a sort of a variation of one of our methods to add in a carbon storage component. And so now there can be, you can get the benefit in a project from getting credits from reducing emissions as well as storing carbon. And it's particularly in the debris layer. So this is around having smaller and less intense fires burning less of the woody debris. So that's quite new. You've already heard a little bit about soil carbon. There is quite a lot of interest in building soil carbon for a whole range of reasons. And so this is definitely another one of those examples where there are a range of benefits for changing land management to build soil carbon. We have a couple of methods again for building soil carbon, and these are around, can be on cropping and grazing land, and it's land managers making decisions to adopt particular sets of activities. They're activities where we have science showing that a change in management will actually build carbon. So it's not a completely open-ended option for the types of activities that people can undertake. But it's about building soil carbon or also by adding biomass essentially, or also reducing losses as well. So that's my overview of the activities. This slide shows where things are up to across the range of different sectors. And so these sectoral descriptions are how we describe sectors as they relate to the emissions accounting categories that we report in broad terms. You can see straight away there that those vegetation methods that I've spoken about have been by far the most successful under the scheme so far. And this is just for projects that have a contract with the Clean Energy Regulator. So a lot of those are around avoiding land clearing and regenerating native vegetation, but there are also tree planting projects in there as well. The savanna burning category that I've shown there, all those credits there, the method that I just spoke to you about is quite new. All of that is around reducing emissions. And that agriculture category, almost all of that agriculture category actually includes contracted projects for soil carbon. So there is quite a lot of progress there. I won't talk about the other sectors. You can see in any detail, you can see there's a reasonable amount contracted under the waste sector and then not so much in the other sectors. One of the reasons there is that the Emissions Reduction Fund picks up from the Carbon Farming Initiative, which was commenced in 2011, and it originally only covered the land sectors and waste, and so some of those other sectors are relatively new to the scheme. And that total 192 million tonnes is the total amount contracted currently in the scheme. And the last auction was run in June, and there's another one in December. And just to give you a few more figures from the Clean Energy Regulator, so there are 429 contracts, and then that figure shows that there's almost 39, and this is at the end of August, almost 39 million credits have already been delivered under contract. So that's almost 35 million out of that 192 million that I showed on the previous slide. There's no scale on this. The idea of this is just to give you an idea. Again, this is the contracted amounts, give you an idea of the scheduled delivery under those contracts well, for the next 10 years or so. So this covers sequestration projects as well as emissions reduction projects. And so some of those projects have longer timeframes than others, and so obviously there's been a building portfolio of projects as well. The purpose of this is just to show you the progress that is being made and what is scheduled to be delivered over that time. So now I just wanted to go back to some of the things I started talking about around putting some integrity around the emissions reductions and carbon storage and the credits that are being issued. The set of terms that I've got listed here, we call the offsets integrity standards. They're described in the legislation for the scheme, and these are the things that all of the methods that I've talked about are required to meet so that the emissions reductions are genuine. Additional is about being able to demonstrate that the emissions reduction or carbon storage wouldn't have occurred in the ordinary course of business if the project wasn't being undertaken. There's a range of different ways of assessing that. In some cases it's quite straightforward, in others it's much more complicated. Sometimes it takes us quite, even a number of years to work through determining arrangements that can give some good rigour around these things. It's pretty obvious that being able to store carbon or reduce emissions need to be able to measure it and verify it. We have, in a lot of cases, we're able to use methods that are already used for our national greenhouse gas inventory for our international reporting. Eligible it relates to our international reporting as well. Activities are only eligible under the scheme if they can contribute to Australia's international targets. So that really means they need to sit somewhere under the framework that all countries report under internationally as well. So it doesn't cover everything, but it comes back to those sorts of categories that I showed. There needs to be sound evidence supporting it. It needs to, we talk about having proven technologies. Pep talked a little bit about that as well. Really to be able to go through and undertake a project, we already need to have some pretty good confidence that it will be able to deliver. And it needs to be conservative, so the estimation methods need to ensure that credits aren't overestimated, so that the government's not giving credits for more emissions reductions or carbon storage than is actually occurring. Then I wanted to just talk about some of the things that are particularly relevant to storing carbon. The first one is permanence, and so again in the scheme, under legislation, any carbon sequestration project needs to elect a permanence period, and a permanence period can be a commitment to maintain the stored carbon for either 100 years or 25 years. And those periods, it's not suggesting that is permanent, completely permanent, but broadly equivalent to permanence. Remembering that the scheme is also around having to balance participation, incentives for participation with rigour. Having an option to select 25 years gives a bit more flexibility around land use, but with that comes also a bit more risk to the government if those carbon stores are reversed after 25 years, and so anyone electing a 25-year permanence period needs to accept a 20% discount on their credits, so they're only getting 80% of the credits generated issued to them. The scheme also recognises natural disturbance, fires, drought will occur. There's the risk of losses of stored carbon. So rather than assuming it won't happen, there's a range of measures in the scheme to deal with that. The first one is that every project around storing carbon, as well as if they have a discount for permanence, get a 5% discount on the credits issued, so they're only a maximum of 95% of their credits. And that's sort of an insurance program across the scheme to take into account unintended losses across the scheme. I've already mentioned credits are only issued as they're generated. If a project's progressing and there is some sort of a loss, they aren't issued any more credits until they get back up to where they were and then ahead of where they were as well. But they're not penalised for losses as long as they actually take action to either replant or enable the stored carbon to be restored. So it's still about providing an incentive and not penalising someone. However, there are actual penalties in the scheme if there are deliberate actions to remove stores and they're not restored over time. So there's a sort of number of penalties, and those requirements to maintain the stores of carbon also apply during the permanence period. So if a project's been run for 25 years and issued credits and accepts a 100-year permanence period, they're obliged to maintain carbon for those 100 years, and if there are losses in that period, they're also obliged to restore them as well. So that's my attempt at a quick overview of the scheme. As a couple of summary comments, the scheme's been going for a few years. We think it's made some good progress. You can see the carbon storage side of the scheme in particular is making some good progress. A lot of the things that we've done have picked up on concepts from overseas, but from our understanding, a lot of the governance around the scheme and then also the specifics in our technical approaches are leading approaches that are very rigorous and give us a good amount of confidence behind the scheme. Having said that, we're still learning all the time. Landholders and the broader industry are learning all the time. We're in a process of reviewing. We look at making improvements to methods, and we're also looking for new opportunities. We think we've got a pretty good coverage of opportunities, but where there are other new things come up, there's also the potential for picking those opportunities up as well. Thank you.